The phone vibrated on the mahogany desk in Redwood Falls while I watched my financial advisor review our portfolio. My husband's voice was a jagged edge of triumph over the speaker. "I am leaving you," he said. "I sold everything today. 10 years of marriage, gone in one afternoon." He believed he was burning my world down, but he had no idea I was the one who built the furnace. My name is Laura Whitman. At 38 years old, I have cultivated a life in Redwood Falls that looks, from the outside, like the quintessential American dream. I have the sensible SUV, the colonial house with the manicured lawn, and a wardrobe full of neutral tones that suggest a woman who is content to blend into the background. People see me and think I am the reliable wife, the steady presence behind a successful man. They see a woman who is predictable. They are wrong. I sat in the office of my financial advisor, Marcus, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sun. The office smelled of expensive leather and old paper. Marcus was humming as he pulled up our joint portfolio on his large monitor, showing a growth of 12% over the last fiscal year. I sat in the office of my financial advisor, Marcus, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sun. "I am leaving you, and before you think about the house or the accounts," I sold it all. Everything. The Northline shares, the property, the investments. I have the liquid cash, and I am leaving Redwood Falls tonight to start a life you will never be a part of. Marcus froze, his hand hovering over the mouse. He looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, but I remained perfectly still. My pulse did not even quicken. I stared at a small scratch on the mahogany desk, feeling a strange, clinical detachment. "I see," I said. My voice was as flat as the horizon. "You see," Daniel let out a harsh, barking laugh. "That is all I just wiped out 10 years of your security in one afternoon. And you have nothing to say. You always were so pathetic. Laura, so quiet. You just sat there while I built an empire, and now you can sit there while I take it away. Do not bother coming home. The locks will be changed by 5 o'clock. Daniel, are you sure you have thought this through?" I asked, leaning back in the plush chair. I made sure to let my voice tremble just a fraction, a calculated performance of the broken wife he expected. "I have never been more sure of anything," he snapped. "I have got 90% of the value in accounts you cannot touch. Goodbye. Laura?" Enjoy the silence. The line went dead. Marcus began to stammer, his face turning a bright shade of red. "Laura, we have to call the police. We have to freeze the accounts. If he really sold the Northline interest, that is millions of dollars." I looked at Marcus and finally allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. It was the smile of a predator that had been waiting in the tall grass for a very long time. Daniel thought he had won because he had spent a decade looking at me without ever actually seeing me. He saw a housewife. He did not see the woman who had spent 5 hours every night for the last 3 years studying the fine print of our corporate structure. He did not see the woman who had quietly diverted the intellectual property rights of Northline Systems into a private holding company 2 years ago. He thinks he sold everything. "Marcus," I said, my voice returning to its natural, steady rhythm. But Daniel has never understood the difference between the shadow of a mountain and the mountain itself. He sold the shell. He sold the name. He sold $100,000 worth of office furniture and a lease that was about to expire anyway. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. The air in the office felt crisp and charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Daniel had just handed me the one thing I needed to finish him a clear, documented intent to defraud his spouse during a divorce. He had walked right into the center of the web, believing he was the spider. "Do we file the injunction?" Marcus whispered, looking at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. "Not yet," I replied. "Let him run. Let him spend a few $1,000s on a first-class ticket and a champagne toast to his own genius. I want him to feel the full weight of his victory before I let him realize it is made of lead. The hum of my car's engine was the only sound as I drove through the quiet streets of Redwood Falls, my mind drifting back 8 years to the cold November morning when Northline Systems was born. Daniel had been a mid-level manager with a dream that far outpaced his bank account. He had the charisma, the jawline of a leader, and a vision for a logistics firm that could dominate the tri-state area. What he did not have was the $500,000 required to secure the initial contracts and the office space. Laura, I just need a chance, he had whispered that night, pacing our small apartment. The bank laughed at me. They said I have no collateral. If I could just get the seed money, I know I could turn it into millions. I had watched him from the shadows of the kitchen, already having calculated the risks. I had an inheritance from my grandmother's estate, nearly $600,000 sitting in a shielded trust that Daniel barely knew existed. I could have given it to him directly. But even then, a small, instinctual part of me knew better. I set up a shell company called LW, Strategic Holdings, and funneled the money through a series of private loans with ironclad terms that Daniel was too desperate to question. He thought he was dealing with an anonymous angel investor. He never realized the angel was sleeping right next to him. As Northline Systems grew, so did Daniel's ego. Within 3 years, we moved into the Colonial House. Within 5, he was being featured in local business journals as the self-made king of Redwood Falls. I played my part perfectly. The supportive wife who organized the charity galas and smiled at the holiday parties while Daniel held court. It is all about grit, gentlemen, Daniel would say, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon at our annual summer mixer. I started with 0, no handouts, no safety nets, just a clear head and 100% dedication to the grind. I would stand in the corner, sipping sparkling water, feeling the weight of the secret documents I kept in a safety deposit box. While Daniel spent his nights networking at country clubs, I spent mine at the kitchen table after he went to sleep. I did not just watch our bank accounts. I studied. I took online courses in contract law and advanced corporate finance. I learned how to read the fine print of every merger and every acquisition he signed. I knew the exact moment when his confidence turned into dangerous arrogance. The first real cracks appeared 3 years ago. We were at a dinner with the mayor when Daniel leaned over and patted my hand as if I were a child. Laura, darling, do not worry your head about the expansion talk. It is a bit too technical for you. You just focus on the garden and the new drapes. The table had laughed, a polite, suburban sound that felt like a slap. I had forced myself to smile, my eyes fixed on my plate. Of course, Daniel, I had replied, I wouldn't want to get in the way of your genius. That was the night I stopped being his partner and became his architect of record. I began moving the intellectual property of Northline, piece by piece, into the holding company he did not own. I restructured the debt. I made sure that every major asset he thought was his was actually leased from an entity controlled by me. He was so busy looking at his own reflection in the glass towers of the city that he never looked at the foundations. Now, as I pulled into our driveway, I saw the moving truck parked out front. Daniel was throwing boxes into the back with a frantic, joyful energy. He saw my car and stopped, a smirk crossing his face as he checked his watch. It was exactly 4 o'clock. He thought he was 5 minutes away from freedom. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking on the pavement. I noticed a small, blue folder sitting on the passenger seat of his luxury sedan, the door hanging open. It was a transfer of title for our vacation home in Aspen. I looked at the signature line from a distance. It was not his handwriting, nor was it mine. It was a crisp, professional script that I had seen once before on a nondescript business card. "You are late, Laura," Daniel called out, his voice dripping with mock pity. "I told you. The locks change at 5. You have exactly 60 minutes to grab whatever fits in your trunk." I did not answer. I just watched the way he gripped his phone, his thumb hovering over a notification that made him grin. It was a tiny detail, a flicker of light from his screen, but I recognized the logo of a bank we had never used. He was not just leaving, he was already celebrating a victory that had not happened yet. I stepped through the front door of our colonial home, the heavy oak clicking shut behind me with a finality that felt like a gavel hitting a sounding block. The air inside was thick with the scent of Daniel's expensive cologne and the frantic energy of a man who thought he was escaping a sinking ship with all the gold. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway, and the walls already looked skeletal where our shared history had been stripped away. Daniel was in the living room, tossing his designer cashmere sweaters into a leather duffel bag. He looked up when I entered, his face flushed with a mixture of adrenaline and a cruel, soaring triumph. He checked his watch, the gold Rolex I had bought him for our 5th anniversary. "You are right on time, Laura," he said, his voice ringing with an artificial vibrance. "I was worried you would stay at Marcus's office all afternoon to cry. But I suppose reality has finally set in. I have already wired the proceeds from the sale of the secondary Northline accounts. By tomorrow morning, 80% of what you thought was our net worth will be sitting in a private offshore fund. You can keep the furniture. I am feeling generous." I walked toward the kitchen island, my movements measured and fluid. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply watched him, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he zipped the bag. He was a man possessed by the illusion of his own brilliance. "I understand." "Daniel," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "If this is the path you have chosen, then I will not stand in your way. You have always been the one to make the big decisions." He paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his eyes before it was swallowed by his ego. He had spent 10 years waiting for me to be this submissive, and now that it was happening, he was too intoxicated by his own success to realize how wrong it felt. "Finally," he scoffed, throwing a stray shoe into a box. "You finally admit it. You were always just a passenger, Laura. I was the engine. I was the vision. You should be happy I am leaving you enough to pay the property taxes for at least a few months. Most men in my position would leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back." I reached into my handbag and pulled out a slim, navy blue manila folder. I placed it on the marble countertop between us. The light from the chandelier caught the gold-embossed seal of a notary public on the top corner. "Since you are in such a hurry to start your new life." "I had my lawyer draft these final release forms," I said, sliding the folder toward him. "They are just standard waivers. They acknowledge that you have taken full control of the liquidated assets and that you release me from any further liability regarding Northline's current debts or operational obligations. It is a clean break. Exactly what you wanted." Daniel laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Liability. The company is worth millions. Laura, there is no debt that I cannot cover 10 times over with the cash I just moved. You are still trying to play the worried housewife even as I am walking out the door." He stepped toward the island, grabbing a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. He flipped through the first 2 pages, his eyes scanning the text with the impatient arrogance of a man who believed he already knew everything the world had to teach him. He saw the words, "transfer of authority," and "final settlement," and his smile widened. You really are giving up easily," he murmured, his pen hovering over the signature line. "I almost feel sorry for you. You are losing the best thing that ever happened to you because you were too boring to keep up. I just want it to be over." "Daniel," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "I cannot fight you anymore. Just sign them. So you can go to whatever life you have planned with Piper." The mention of her name made him freeze for a split second, a guilty smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He did not deny it. He did not even care anymore. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name with a flourish, a bold, sweeping script that covered all 3 copies. He did not look at the 3rd page. He did not notice the clause hidden in the middle of paragraph 14, the one that defined operational obligations as including the personal guarantees on the multi-million-dollar high-interest bridge loans I had moved into his name last month. He slammed the folder shut and slid it back to me. There. It is done. I am a free man, and you are just a memory. I picked up the folder and tucked it under my arm. The silence in the room stretched out, long and cold. Daniel grabbed his bags and headed for the door, his footsteps heavy and confident on the hardwood. He did not look back. He did not see me finally look up, my eyes no longer dull with feigned defeat, but burning with a quiet, lethal clarity. He had just signed his own financial death warrant, and he was whistling as he walked toward the garage. Daniel stopped with his hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door, the weight of his leather duffel bags pulling his shoulders down. He looked back at me, his expression caught between annoyance and a lingering, toxic pity. What is it now? Laura, if you are going to beg for another 5% of the liquidated cash, save your breath. I have a flight to catch at 7 o'clock. I didn't move from the kitchen island. I simply turned the navy blue folder around so it faced him, my fingers resting lightly on the cold marble. I just thought you might want to understand what you actually signed. Daniel, you always had such a distaste for the boring details of corporate governance. You preferred the spotlight, the handshakes, and the bourbon. He scoffed, dropping one bag on the rug. It is a settlement. I get the cash. You get the house and the furniture. It is simple enough for even you to grasp. Actually, it is quite complex, I said, my voice dropping into a clinical, rhythmic tone. You see, you have spent the last 8 years telling everyone in Redwood Falls that you built Northline Systems from the ground up. You even believed it yourself. But if you had ever looked at the articles of incorporation for the parent entity, you would have seen that Northline is merely a subsidiary. It is 99% owned by a firm called Bayou Strategic Holdings. Daniel's brow furrowed. He walked back into the room, his confidence flickering like a dying candle. L.U. Holdings. That is just a shell for the investors. I am the one who makes the calls. I am the chairman. You were the face. Daniel. I corrected him. A small, sharp smile finally breaking through my mask. The initials stand for Laura Whitman. I am the sole director of the parent company. Every single executive decision you thought you made the office expansion, the new fleet of trucks. Even that ridiculous private jet lease was sent to my encrypted email for final approval. I have been your boss since the day the first dollar was deposited into our corporate account. He froze. His face went through a rapid, grotesque transformation, moving from confusion to a deep, sickly, pale shade of gray. That is not possible. I signed those contracts. I saw the growth. I saw the numbers. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see. I replied, stepping around the island to face him. By signing the documents in this folder today, you did not just take the cash from the sale of the company. You acknowledged that those funds were actually personal bridge loans with a 30% interest rate, which you have now personally guaranteed. You did not sell Northline's assets. Daniel, you sold the brand name and the retail furniture. Then you borrowed $2 million against your own future to pay for your escape with Piper. You are lying, he stammered, his breath starting to hitch. He stumbled toward the counter, grabbing the edge of the marble for support. I have 80% of the shares in my name. I checked the ledger last year. You checked the ledger of the retail branch, which owns nothing but a lease and some desks. I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning in the mountains. Every piece of intellectual property, every major logistics contract, and the very software that runs the Northline network is owned by me. You just sold the shell and kept the debt. Even that Rolex on your wrist. I approved the reimbursement for it as a marketing expense through a company I control. You have never owned anything. Daniel. Not the car, not the company, and certainly not me. Daniel's knees buckled slightly. The arrogance that had defined him for a decade was evaporating, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He looked down at the signature on the page, the ink still fresh, realized that he had spent 10 years mocking a woman who had been holding his leash the entire time. Laura, please, you cannot do this, he whispered, his voice cracking. I have already committed to the new venture. I have put down a deposit on the penthouse in the city. If that money is a loan, I will be ruined before I even start. You aren't ruined yet, Daniel, I said, leaning in so close I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. But you are finally beginning to understand the price of your own ego. You wanted to leave me with nothing. Well, you are halfway there. You should probably check your flight status. I wouldn't want you to miss your departure. Considering you probably cannot afford a second ticket. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as if searching for a way out of a trap that had been closing for 3,000 days. The psychological collapse was visible, the way he gripped his phone, the way his chest heaved. He wasn't the victor anymore. He was just a man realizing he was standing in a house that didn't belong to him, holding a bag full of clothes he couldn't replace. I watched him struggle to breathe, his expensive silk tie suddenly looking like a noose. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold satisfaction of a master weaver watching the final threads of a tapestry pull tight. For 10 years, I had played the part of the quiet observer, but today, I was the only person in the room who understood the law. You were so proud of that wire transfer this morning. Daniel, I said, my voice steady and devoid of heat. $2,400,000 moved at 10:15 sharp. You thought you were being decisive. In reality, you were documenting a felony. I had every right, he managed to choke out, his eyes darting to the door as if a SWAT team might burst in at any second. The accounts had my name on them. I was the signatory. I am the one who built the relationships. It is my money. Being a signatory is not the same as being the owner, I replied, crossing my arms and leaning against the cold marble of the island. When you moved those funds from the Northline operational account to a private entity in the Cayman Islands, you did not just take your share. You embezzled capital from a subsidiary of LW, Strategic Holdings. Since I am the sole shareholder of LW, you effectively stole from me, and because you did it while actively misrepresenting the company's value to your buyers, you have added 3 counts of wire fraud to the list. That is a federal sentence. Daniel, not a civil one. You set me up, he whispered, his face a mask of sweating agony. You let me think I was in control of the board. I did not set you up, Daniel. I simply stopped correcting your mistakes. For 3,650 days, I watched you underestimate me. I spent 4 years meticulously separating our personal assets from the corporate structure while you were busy buying rounds of drinks for people who only liked your checkbook. I sat next to you at dinner while I was reviewing the server logs that showed you were using company funds to pay for Piper's apartment in the city. Every 5-star hotel, every piece of jewelry, every dinner that cost over $500, it is all documented as a breach of your fiduciary duty. He tried to lunge forward, to grab the folder from my hand, but he stopped when I did not even flinch. His hands were shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. I will fight this. I will hire the best lawyers in the state. I still have the cash. I have enough to bury you in litigation for 20 years. With what money, I asked, tilting my head. The $2 million you just moved, I have already filed an emergency injunction. Marcus was on the phone with the bank's compliance officer before you even hung up with me at the office earlier. Those funds are frozen. And since you signed the document acknowledging that money as a personal loan with a 30% interest rate, You are now legally obligated to pay back the full amount, plus penalties, within 30 days. If you do not, the collateral kicks in. Do you remember what the collateral was on page 12? Daniel's jaw dropped. He had not read page 12. He had not even read page 5. What? What did you do to me? I tied the loan to your personal equity in the Northline brand name and your future earnings. I said, you literally signed away the right to use your own professional reputation to ever work in logistics again. Your arrogance was the perfect evidence. Daniel, you were so convinced I was too stupid to understand the business that you did not even bother to have a lawyer look at the standard waivers I gave you. You wanted to win so badly that you forgot to check if there was a floor beneath your feet. He slumped against the kitchen counter, the air leaving his lungs in a long, rattling hiss. For the first time in 10 years, the mask of the self-made titan was gone. In its place was a man who looked every bit of his 42 years, suddenly realizing that the woman he had treated as furniture was the one who had designed his prison. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw it the cold, sharp realization of total ruin. His eyes did not hold anger anymore. They held a hollow, suffocating despair. Laura, please. We can talk about this. We can find a way, he whimpered, his voice trailing off into a pathetic, broken whisper. I did not blink. I did not move. I just watched him realize that the conversation had ended years ago. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like the weight of a mile of seawater. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes wide and bloodshot, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just pulled a knife in a crowded room. Laura, please. Listen to me, he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. We have 10 years, a whole decade. We can find a middle ground. Just give me the $2 million back. I will sign anything. I will give you 50% of my new venture. Please. I have people waiting for me. Piper is waiting. I tilted my head, looking at him with the same clinical interest I would show a failing spreadsheet. The $2 million is not a bargaining chip, Daniel. It is stolen property that has already been flagged by the bank's fraud department. And as for your new venture, you cannot build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. You have no capital, no intellectual property, and as of 5 minutes ago, no reputation. You cannot do this, he screamed, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. The car out there, the Mercedes I bought, that is mine. Actually, I said, my voice smooth and polite. The Mercedes is a corporate lease held by L.W. Strategic Holdings for the use of the acting CEO of Northline. Since you are no longer the CEO, the lease has been terminated. There is a tow truck scheduled to arrive at 6 o'clock this evening to recover the asset. If you try to drive it off the property, I will be forced to report it as a stolen vehicle. Daniel's hands flew to his hair, clutching at the strands as if he could pull his crumbling reality back into place. The watch. This Rolex cost me $15,000. It was a reimbursement for a marketing expense that I personally approved last year. I replied, if you want to keep it, you will need to pay back the full $15,000 to the company, plus a 10% penalty for personal use of corporate funds. Otherwise, please leave it on the counter. It is technically company property. You are a monster, he spat, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. How long have you been planning this execution? I haven't been planning an execution. Daniel, I said softly, I have been observing a slow-motion suicide. You were the one who decided I was invisible. You were the one who decided to cheat, to lie, and to steal. I just made sure that when you finally jumped, you did not take my life with you. Now, it is 4 o'clock and 15 minutes. You have exactly 45 minutes before the locksmith arrives to change the codes on the gate and every door in this house. The air in the living room felt thin, as if the house itself were rejecting him. Daniel looked around at the expensive art, the crystal decanters, the velvet curtains, all the things he thought defined his worth. Each one was a ghost now. I don't have anywhere to go, he said, his arrogance finally replaced by a raw, pathetic terror. Piper's apartment? The lease is in the company name. You took that too. I took nothing that was yours. Daniel, I simply reclaimed what was mine. I said, stepping toward the hallway. Your clothes are in the bags by the door. I have left you $300 in cash in your briefcase. It should be enough for a motel and a few meals until you figure out which of your loyal friends will actually answer your call when they find out you are broke. Laura, I am sorry, he whimpered, moving toward me with his hands outstretched. I was wrong. I see that now. Give me one more chance. We can be a team again. I stepped back, the movement sharp and decisive. We were never a team. Daniel, I was the architect and you were just the bright, shiny paint on the walls. And the paint is peeling. I pointed toward the front door. He stood there for a moment, a broken man in a $5,000 suit, clutching a single duffel bag as if it were a life raft. He looked at me one last time, hoping for a spark of the old Laura, the one who forgave and forgot. He found nothing but a mirror of his own cruelty, reflected back with perfect icy precision. He did not say another word. He turned and walked out, his shoulders hunched, his footsteps echoing through the hollow house. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in 10 years, I breathed in air that did not taste like his lies. The silence that followed the closing of the front door was not empty. It was a canvas, vast and white, waiting for the first stroke of my new reality. I did not waste a single second on tears or reflection. I walked directly into the mahogany-paneled study, the room Daniel had always referred to as his sanctuary, though he had rarely used it for anything other than drinking bourbon and admiring his own awards. I opened the matte black laptop I kept hidden in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, the one with the encrypted drive and the direct link to the LWW, Strategic Holdings server. By 6 o'clock that evening, I had initiated a series of pre-programmed protocols. I scheduled a mandatory video conference for 8 o'clock with the senior vice presidents and the lead legal counsel of Northline Systems. When the clock struck 8, I sat in front of the camera, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer and an expression that left no room for questions. The gallery of faces on the screen was a study in collective shock. They had spent years seeing me as the woman who brought cookies to the office holiday party. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice was a low, resonant hum that cut through the chatter. Mrs. Whitman Sarah, the head of operations, stammered. Her eyes were darting around her home office. "Where is Daniel?" He told us he was finalizing a major restructuring today and that we should wait for his call. Daniel is no longer associated with Northline Systems or any subsidiary of LW Strategic Holdings, I replied, my tone as cold and precise as a scalpel. As the sole director and majority shareholder of the parent company, I am assuming the role of acting chair effective immediately. You will find a comprehensive operational audit and a new set of reporting structures in your secure inboxes by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Sarah, I expect the 90-day logistics forecast on my desk by 8 o'clock sharp. We are moving forward with the expansion into the tri-state area tonight. The silence on the call was absolute. For 10 years, they had assumed the man in the expensive suit was the architect. Now, they were looking at the person who actually held the blueprints, but the contracts, the lead counsel, a man named Henderson, began. Daniel signed the exclusivity agreements last week. If he is out, the board will need to ratify the change. There is no board, Henderson. There is only me. I said, and the contracts he signed were through a retail entity that has been insolvent since 3 o'clock this afternoon. We are migrating those accounts to the parent firm. If you have a problem with the legality, I suggest you read the bylaws I drafted 3 years ago. Does anyone else have a question before we begin the briefing? No one spoke. They simply nodded, their expressions shifting from confusion to a wary, newfound respect. Over the next 48 hours, Northline systems began to breathe again. Without Daniel's ego-driven interruptions, his constant need for validation, and his penchant for 60-minute lunch meetings that accomplished nothing, the company moved with terrifying efficiency. I approved 3 major logistics contracts that had been sitting on his desk for 5 months because he could not decide which font looked more masculine on the signature page. By Tuesday morning, the transition was invisible to the outside world, but internal productivity had increased by nearly 20%. In the social circles of Redwood Falls, the whispers began to spread like wildfire. At the country club and the local cafes, the narrative was shifting. People said Daniel had suffered a nervous breakdown. People said he had been caught in a massive embezzlement scheme and fled the state. I did not correct them. I did not need to. When I walked through the lobby of the Northline building on Wednesday, the security guards didn't just tip their caps, they stood at attention. The supportive wife was gone, replaced by a woman whose silence was now recognized for what it always was, a form of extreme control. My phone remained a graveyard of missed calls and frantic, nonsensical messages from Daniel. "Laura, please, pick up," his voice said in a recording from 3 o'clock in the morning, sounding ragged and hollow. "Piper left. She took the luggage and the cash I had in the safe. She saw the freeze on the accounts and she just vanished. I am at a motel off the interstate. I have $42. Laura, please. I am your husband." I listened to the message once, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even a flicker of regret. I simply hit the delete button and blocked the new number he was calling from. I then sent the recording to my legal team to be added to the file for the restraining order. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my new office, looking out over the lights of Redwood Falls. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't the shadow behind the man. I was the mountain itself. The power I had spent years building in the dark was finally in the light, and it felt like the first deep breath I had taken in 38 years. The silence in the colonial house was not the heavy, oppressive kind that follows a funeral. It was the sterile, expectant silence of an operating room after a successful surgery. I sat on the edge of the velvet sofa in the living room, the moonlight tracing silver patterns across the floorboards where the moving boxes had once stood. For the first time in 10 years, the air did not vibrate with the frequency of Daniel's restless, demanding presence. The emptiness was a luxury I had earned through 3,650 days of disciplined invisibility. I looked at the space on the wall where a portrait of us had hung, a glossy image taken during our 7th anniversary. In the photo, Daniel had been leaning forward, commanding the frame, while I stood a half step behind him, my smile practiced and soft. Looking at that ghost of a woman now, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I had spent a decade being the silence in the room so that he could be the noise. I had allowed him to believe that my quietness was a lack of substance, a void he could fill with his own inflated ego. The cost of that silence was high. I had missed family birthdays, ignored the condescending whispers of our neighbors, and buried my own ambitions under the weight of his Northline dreams. But as I sat in the stillness, I realized there was no regret. Regret is for those who are caught unprepared by the storms of life. I had not been caught. I had been the one measuring the wind speed and reinforcing the levees for years. I picked up a small, crystal paperweight from the side table, a gift Daniel had given me for my 35th birthday. He had bought it at the airport gift shop 45 minutes before coming home, forgetting that I hated clutter. I remembered the way he had handed it to me, barely looking up from his phone. "Here, Laura. It is just a little something," he had said, his voice distracted. I have a big merger closing tomorrow. I cannot spend the whole night celebrating." I had thanked him, placed it on the shelf, and gone back to reviewing the tax lines I was quietly placing on his personal holdings. Back then, I had even doubted myself. I had wondered if I was cold, if I was capable of the very ruthlessness I saw in him. But tonight, I understood that I had underestimated the woman staring back at me in the mirror. I was not cold, I was simply finished. The revenge I had executed was not born from a sudden flash of anger or a broken heart. Anger is messy and leaves traces. This was a business strategy, a multi-year campaign of asset reallocation and legal maneuvering. It was the result of 100 nights spent studying contract law while he was out with his associates, and 1,000 small, calculated nods when he claimed my ideas as his own. You really thought I was just a ghost in your house," I whispered to the empty room. My voice was steady, the tremors of the previous years finally gone. "You thought you could just erase me and walk away with the ink." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling lights of Redwood Falls. For too long, I had been the hidden hand, the ghost in the machine of Northline Systems. I had played the role of the suburban wife so perfectly that even the town's elite forgot I had a mind of my own. That ended tonight. Tomorrow, the local business journal would receive a detailed press release regarding the total acquisition of Northline's core assets by L.W. Strategic Holdings. There would be no mention of Daniel Whitman except as a footnote in a history of mismanagement. I was stepping out of the shadows and into the center of the frame. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my movements precise. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a final, desperate email from Daniel's personal account, titled "Please." I did not open it. I simply moved it to the folder marked Evidence. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the invitation to the Redwood Falls Annual Business Gala, taking place in 48 hours. It was the biggest event of the year, the stage where Daniel had planned to debut his new venture with Piper. I picked up a pen and checked the "Will Attend" box, writing my name in a clear, bold hand. "It is time for the architect to see the building," I said to myself. The grand ballroom of the Redwood Falls Plaza was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos when I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. The air hummed with the high society gossip of the tri-state area, and tonight, my name was the only currency that mattered. I stood near the marble fountain, sipping sparkling water, watching the elite of this town realize that the woman they had ignored for 10 years was now the most powerful person in the room. I knew he would come. A man like Daniel cannot handle being erased in silence. At exactly 8:30, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open with a violence that made the band stumble in their rhythm. Daniel Whitman stood there, looking like a ghost of the titan he used to be. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was crooked, and his eyes were wild with a frantic, cornered energy. "There she is," he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "There is the woman who stole a 10-year legacy. You all think she is a genius. She is a thief. She gutted Northline from the inside while I was building it." The room went cold. The mayor and the heads of 3 major banks turned, their glasses halfway to their lips. I did not move. I did not even set down my drink. I simply watched him stumble toward the center of the floor, clutching a tattered manila envelope as if it were a holy relic. "I have the proof," Daniel roared, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I found the original filings from 8 years ago. The signature on the primary capital investment? It is forged. She forged my name to take control of the parent company. He reached me, his face inches from mine, smelling of cheap gin and desperation. He slammed the papers onto a nearby cocktail table. "Laura, tell them how you lied to the board. Tell them you stole the $3 million in seed money from the L.W. accounts. I looked down at the papers, then back at him. My expression remained a mask of polite concern. Daniel, you should really sit down. You are making a scene that you cannot afford to finish. Don't you talk down to me, he screamed, his hands shaking so violently the papers fluttered to the floor. I built this 100% of the sweat and the blood was mine. I signaled to Marcus, who was standing 10 feet away with 2 men in dark suits. They weren't security. They were process servers. I turned back to the crowd, my voice projected with a clarity that silenced every whisper in the hall. Daniel is right about one thing, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a cold blade. There was a forgery, but it wasn't 8 years ago. It was 3 days ago, when Daniel tried to backdate a transfer of assets to a mistress named Piper Lorne to avoid his creditors. And as for the seed money, Marcus, would you show him the bank records we just provided to the district attorney? Marcus stepped forward and handed Daniel a single sheet of paper. Daniel's eyes darted across the lines, and I watched the last bit of color drain from his lips. That is your signature on the original loan agreement from L.W. Strategic Holdings. Daniel, I said softly, so only he could hear. The one where you acknowledged that the $500,000 was a private debt to your wife, not an equity stake. You spent 10 years bragging that you started with zero. The IRS and the bank now have the documented proof that you were right. You started with zero, and you are ending with even less. Laura, I didn't. Please, he stammered, his knees buckling. He looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, but he found only the cold, judgmental stares of the people he had tried so hard to impress. The elite of Redwood Falls move away from failure as if it were a contagion. You are being served. Daniel, I continued, my voice returning to its normal volume. A civil suit for 3 counts of fraud and a criminal referral for the embezzlement of company funds. The car is gone. The house is locked. And since you just admitted to forging documents in front of 50 witnesses, I think your night is just beginning. He looked at me then, and for a split second, I saw the man I had once loved, but that man had died 1,000 tiny deaths every time he had told me to stay in the kitchen and keep my mouth shut. You planned this, he whispered, a tear finally tracking through the sweat on his cheek. The gala, the papers, you wanted them to see. You wanted them to see me die. I wanted you to see what it feels like to be invisible. Daniel, I replied. Now, please leave. You are bothering my guests. The police officers I had prearranged stepped forward, taking him by the elbows. He did not fight. He just looked hollow, a man who had finally realized he was a character in a story he no longer controlled. As they led him out, the room began to murmur again, a dark, rhythmic sound of a social order resetting itself. I was in control. The company was mine. But as I looked at the empty space where he had stood, I realized the final thread of our marriage had been severed, leaving nothing but the cold, hard clarity of my own future. The hallway was cold, smelling of floor wax and stale air. Daniel sat on the edge of the wooden bench, his head bowed and his hands cuffed. The police officer stood a few feet away, granting me 2 minutes of private silence before they moved him to the precinct. This was the final page of a book that had taken 10 years to write. Daniel looked up as I approached, his face a map of ruin and confusion. You let me do it, he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying realization. You watched me wire that money. You watched me pack my bags. Why did you not just say something? I stood over him, my shadow swallowing his slumped form. Because if I had stopped you, Daniel, you would have still believed you were the master of this game. I let you think you won because I wanted you to walk into the trap with a smile on your face. I wanted your ego to be the hand that pulled the trigger on your own life. Every lie you told, every dollar you moved, and every boast you made tonight was another brick in the wall of your own prison. I needed the world to see you exactly as you are, a man who built his castle on someone else's land. His breath hitched, a jagged sound of a soul collapsing. 10 years. I gave you 10 years of my life. No, Daniel, I replied, my voice as sharp as a diamond. I gave you 10 years of my silence, and that was the most expensive thing you ever owned. You thought you were the sun and I was just a rock reflecting your light. But the sun has gone down, and you are realizing that you were never the source of the heat. Every contract, every lease, and every penny was under my control from day one. You were just a temporary tenant in my ambition. He began to sob, a quiet, rhythmic shaking of his shoulders. The man who had walked into the ballroom at 8:30, thinking he was a king, was now just a number in a police file. He looked at his hands, realizing the gold watch was gone, the car keys were gone, and the woman he had treated like furniture was the only power left in the room. What? What happens now, he asked, his eyes wide with a pathetic, childlike fear. Now, I go home to my house, I said, and you go to the life you actually earned. 100% of the fallout is yours to carry. The board has already met. The transition to L.W. Strategic Holdings is finalized. By tomorrow morning, the name Whitman will be nothing more than a case study in corporate fraud and personal failure. I did not wait for his response. I did not need to hear his apologies or his excuses. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. The click of my shoes echoed with a steady, peaceful rhythm. I felt no joy, no soaring sense of triumph. I simply felt the quiet satisfaction of a project completed, a debt paid in full. I walked out of the station and into the cool night air of Redwood Falls. The town was quiet, the lights of the city shimmering like a sea of possibilities. I climbed into the back of the town car, where Marcus was waiting with the final set of papers to be filed at 9 o'clock. I looked back at the building one last time. Daniel was behind those walls, finally understanding that he had never possessed anything at all. He had been a guest in my life, and his reservation had finally expired. I leaned back into the leather seat and closed my eyes. The architect finally at rest. Thank you for listening to this story. Please leave a comment below to let us know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more listeners.